I'm Martin Lowe, Asian football writer for The Asian Game. The Asian Game is a website and a podcast dedicated to in-depth coverage and analysis of Asian football. We'll hope to have wall-to-wall coverage of the World Cup and the Asian Cup next year.
Cool. All right. So let's kick it off this way. Can you describe how the maybe Qatari media is covering this particular World Cup, or how Asian media in general is looking at it?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of excitement from an Asian perspective. I think there was a lot of excitement off the last World Cup. It was the best performing World Cup of any that has gone by. We've seen expanded numbers of Asian teams coming to this World Cup. This will be a record high in terms of numbers of participants. But the kind of sour note of it, with a few months left to go, or a couple of months now to go to the World Cup, is the Iranian war kind of dominating a lot of the conversation. And that has a significant impact, obviously, on those countries that are nearer Iran, in terms of Iraq, in terms of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So it has been dampened slightly in terms of that kind of anticipation building up to it. But I think it always was going to be anyway, because following 2022, the interest is significantly lower. It's not in your face in terms of the World Cup coming down. And I think for all that, I think expectations are a bit more muted for it. And I think hopefully that will be a bit more positive from that respect. Yes, we're going.
No, do you draw a parallel between how the media covers things and how the fans themselves are anticipating the World Cup? Is there a difference there?
I think with Qatar, I think it's a bit of an odd one. I think it's been 4 years it's been a roller coaster, really. And I think heading into the 2022 World Cup, which was their first World Cup, first opportunity to be seen on an international gaze, I think everybody was clued up and understood where they were going to. It was a big, long project running up to it. Whereas this World Cup feels a little bit different. It's been a very disjointed 4 years over the last 4 years. And I think both the QFA and the fans and the national team probably aren't best fellows from this respect. So I think everybody's quite happy to see the back end of this World Cup qualifying campaign and hope to kind of move on to better things after this World Cup, which may oddly kind of put in a better place to provide a shock or a surprise, hopefully, as we move forward.
Cool. So I'm going to ask you to play doctor, and I want you to diagnose perhaps the state of Qatari football. Is it in a good place? Is it healthy? Is it off color? Like, where are we with it?
It's probably very similar to where we were at the last World Cup. If anything, really, it's probably taken a backward step for all that. I think there was a lot going into the World Cup, like many hosts of a World Cup, that there's going to be an ongoing legacy that follows that. But Qatar have always got the kind of the difficulty of a very small population to pull from from a regular basis. So for a country of the size of them, I think we should be saying that they are overachieving by getting to the World Cup, let alone kind of making that steps forward. As I mentioned before, it was 10-year preparation to go to the World Cup, and then following that, it's been a bit more hit and miss in terms of it could be a blessing, could be a disguise in terms of being the day-to-day kind of influence. And I suppose in that part of the world, within the Gulf, you've got Saudi Arabia on your doorstep that are spending billions to kind of make their mark on world football, let alone Asian football. And I think the Qatar Stars League has dropped off significantly in that. You do still get odd good players that kind of come across, like Roberto Firmino, but you don't have the same star power that you potentially had previously. I think on one side, that's a good thing. There's more opportunities for Qatari talent than there is for Saudi talent back at home, but the standard isn't significantly high. They still struggle necessarily within the Champions League, within the domestic game, etc. In terms of the key thing that was supposed to come out of the last World Cup was that more Qatari internationals go into Europe. That hasn't materialised. There's two young players that have gone out on loan to Spain and Belgium, respectively. But and that's with 6 months to go to the World Cup. There's not a kind of groundswell of all the good players going over. So I still think we're in very much the same realms as we were 4 or 3.5 years ago in that respect.
What was the Qatari qualification process? Was it smooth? Because obviously last time they were the hosts, so they didn't need to do it. This time they had to go through that process. How was it?
Well, completely different. As I mentioned, it was smooth as anything last time in terms of 10-year build-up. One coach, one single vision under Felix Sanchez, all the way up until the final event, which we might get to it in terms of how much of an embarrassment that kind of final episode was. This time around, it's been all over the place. 4 managers in 4 years probably tells you how things have kind of changed over that stage. That post-World Cup hangover was a struggle to get over of. And then you had the surprise of going straight into an Asian Cup, which they ran through and won out of really kind of out of nowhere. They're entering this World Cup cycle as Asian champions, which is crazy for anybody who speaks to an Asian football, because they're by no means the best team in Asia, but they have retained their Asian Cup title. As soon as they come out of the Asian Cup into World Cup qualification, it's all over the place again. And again, they're chopping and changing in terms of players, in terms of staff, going through another couple of managers. And Asia, because of the expanded World Cup and then the expanded number of places that were available, Asian qualification just went on and on and on. They had lots of different rounds. And as much as Qatar missed the first kind of boat on that, the kind of fail-safe part of qualification was on the inception of it, the AFC suggested that the best qualifying or the best lucky losers would host that tournament to get through as kind of one of the lucky loser places. Now, it was quite quickly understood earlier on that Saudi Arabia and Qatar weren't going to be one of those two good teams, so there was a big kind of concern that those two countries wouldn't get through. Surprise, surprise, the AFC flipped it and said, "Oh, actually, no. For fairness, we'll put it out to tender because we want to make sure that this event's the best hosted event." And surprise, surprise, Qatar and Saudi Arabia are the ones that hosted it under significant criticism from the outside world. You had people like Carlos Queiroz, Graham Arnold's criticising that kind of approach. And it wasn't just the hosting, it was the scheduling as well. So you had Qatar and Saudi Arabia both having nicer runs, etc., to get qualification. And it did work out, and they scraped through. And they scraped through under a new coach, and they were able to kind of get through to the World Cup. But it feels very much like Asia's been kind of done over a little bit in that respect. Qatar didn't ever get to the same heights that they did under when they won the Asian Cup. And they just scraped their way through just because of an expansion of World Cup. So there's a very much a negative feeling going into it. And in post-qualification, they really haven't improved from it. Again, the Arab Cup failure, they lost to Palestine in December, the first time that's ever happened to them. And that kind of completely shifts kind of that preparation tide. And I think that's what they're struggling to kind of get over, and probably kind of says a lot about the expectations going into the World Cup.
So you said they've had 4 managers in however many years. Are fans happy with the current one? And if maybe describe the style of play.
In short, they're probably not happy with him. If it wasn't a World Cup, he would have already been sacked probably at Christmas. And probably the fact that they've gone through 4 managers, probably the QFA are probably thinking, we're not spending more money on a new coach. We'll kind of give this one a go. It's a familiar name, Julian Lopetegui, who's formerly Spain manager, Real Madrid manager, and obviously went on to Wolves and West Ham most recently. He's had a year in charge, brought in to really safeguard kind of qualification, get it over the line, which he did. He's kind of achieved his goal in terms of those key couple of matches that he needed to get over it. But in general, it hasn't really worked for him. Over the 11 games he's been in management, 6 of them have been defeats. He still doesn't really seem to understand what team he wants to play, what kind of system he wants to play. Kind of tracing back his career, he's usually kind of been known as a possession, attacking focused manager. He hasn't really shown that. It's been very counter-attackive in the games that he's worked in at that stage. And as I mentioned, really, I think he would be under significant pressure to kind of be sacked at this stage. In one way, because in March they were supposed to play Argentina and Serbia as part of the Finalisma kind of big event in Qatar. It got cancelled because of the Iranian war. Qatar had to stay at home and just play kind of behind closed doors friendlies with their under-23 team. And as much as that is an ideal preparation, it probably helped Lopetegui kind of stay in a role. If they'd gone and played Messi in Argentina and got battered 5-0, that probably would have shown him the door only a couple of months out from the World Cup. So it's not a great place to be in. But as I say, in odd terms, 3.5 years ago, they were in the perfect kind of center. Everybody was aligned and knowing where they wanted to go, and they spectacularly failed. So what can be worse than that?
You could be Ghana or one of those other countries who just sacked their coach. So it could be worse. Yeah. So this is my favorite part where I just ask you to just say a bunch of proper nouns. Like who are their best players Are they in a good moment? And maybe who are some players on the periphery that you think, that guy might have a good World Cup if things go right?
With Qatar, it's kind of it's copy and paste mode really most of the time. They've got this golden generation that were coming through for the last World Cup, and they kind of most of them are still knocking around now. And I think the key one that most people outside of Asian football will know, or should know anyway, is Akram Afif. And I think he's the star of the team. He's probably the only kind of key player that you'd expect to. He deserves to be at a World Cup. He is that kind of shining light. He's incredibly kind of gifted. He's able to kind of be flexible in terms of where he plays, either up down the middle or out on the left. He was the most valuable player at the last Asian Cup, scoring a hat-trick on the final. So I think he is the kind of key kind of star man within the team. At 29, unfortunately, I don't think he's ever going to go back to Europe. He had a little spell very briefly early on in his career and probably came back too soon just because of the World Cup, etc. And I think he's going to, again, a lot of hope is going to be focused on him. I think from the other side of things, in more of a nostalgic fashion, maybe not from kind of the most kind of gifted player on the pitch, but Pedro Correa, who's a kind of diminutive kind of centre back. He's going to break the century of caps if he plays in every game in North America. He's really good on the ball. He's a calming presence for the team, and he's also popped up with a couple of kind of important goals. He scored the goals against Iran and UAE that got into the World Cup. So he's a kind of a sentimental pick. He's Qatar through and through, even though he's born in Cape Verde. Well, like most of this team, that they are kind of assembled kind of nationals from that respect. But there's a lot of kind of pride in terms of the Qatari kind of background for a lot of these players, especially those ones that have come through from the World Cup. I think probably a shot from the blue, and then listening back to my last conversation with you 3.5 years ago, I pick Akram Afif, which would probably be the most obvious. The other one was Almos Ali. There was a lot of hope for him going into the World Cup last time. He's usually a big tournament player, goes missing for most of the match, but always pops up with a goal. Didn't really fix for him in the World Cup, and then following the World Cup, the last few years have just been a real kind of mishmash for him, and it's really kind of seen him kind of drop off the radar. The last year he's really been in and out with injury, but there is no one else really that can put the ball in the back of the net for Qatar. If he gets injured, there's a suggestion that they might bring back a 41-year-old nationalised Argentinian. So we don't want to get down to that level. So Almos Ali, I'm hoping, is going to be that kind of one credible striking option that kind of redeems himself. And if he scores first game of the World Cup, and nobody else picks it up across the world, there'll be people in Asia that will be celebrating significantly.
You know what? Okay, this wasn't on the list, but I have to ask you, because when you said like the last name of one of those players, I was like, damn. Whenever I watch like the Olympics and it's track and it's like Bahrain will have like this Nigerian dude. So I'm like, what percentage would you guess is the Qatari national team made up of foreign-born nationals that have adopted Qatar as their own? And then what's the remainder of actual people born in Qatar?
It was a big thing, and I think it's probably one of the interesting things that probably hasn't been surfaced this World Cup. It was a big thing at the last World Cup because there was so much focus on Qatar and there was a lot of scrutiny around it. I think that the broader mix is probably 75 to 25 in terms of more nationalised players that there are to home-born players. But within those nationalised players, you are in two kind of camps. You are those that have come through at a very early date, either brought in at 9-10 years old. So Almos Ali is a key person. He came across when he was a kid with his family, and has obviously been developed through the Qatari national team. They've still got a couple of others that they've just been able to nationalise after 5 years of kind of being in the league. You'll see an Ed Milson Jr., kind of, again, a name that kind of sticks out, doesn't sound very Qatari. He's Belgian, and he's done very well in the Qatari league the last few years. He's been nationalised. Lucas Mendes, and then an English player, Niall Mason, has just got his first call up in March, who his last club outside of Qatar was Peterborough United 5 years ago. So these are the type of kind of players that are kind of coming through. What I think has been the real focus of conversation lately in Asian football is there's been a significant furore around nationalised players in Malaysia at the moment. And it's really kind of allowed people to look introvertly to kind of say, well, what is the approach in terms of building Asian football as we move forward? What we want to be getting towards is more homegrown kind of stars. And there are a couple within there. Ayub Alawawi, who's the right back. He's somebody who's come through, he's 21-year-olds, again, homeborn. Mubarak Shanan is another kind of exciting winger, but you're hoping that they give those opportunities rather than it's too easy really sometimes to kind of say, well, who's the best player in Qatar over the last few years? Let's nationalise them from that respect. And it was really the downfall of UAE and why they didn't get to the World Cup in the end, because they just were mismatched of players kind of brought in at the last minute rather than building a kind of honing side of things. But it'll always be a thing within Qatar, because Qatar is a place where there's a lot of immigration coming into the country to work on stadiums, work on kind of construction, etc. But alongside that, it's just generally a very small population. So you'll always have that kind of reliance on kind of overseas help as such.
You can tell when you go to the airport. Since our last talk, I flew to Uganda through Doha, and I was like, wow, like the airport is very African. Yeah. It's very African. All right. What would you say is Qatar's floor at this World Cup, and what is their ceiling?
Well, I think the floor is probably through the floor. It depends how far you want to go to. So there's obviously three games, 3 losses at the last World Cup. The worst kind of hosting of a tournament in terms of a record perspective. And I think it was lost within kind of 10, 15 minutes of that first game against Ecuador. They just really struggled to get into it at all. And then they lost confidence. Confidence was a massive thing. And where we've seen them do well in Asia, particularly, it's been where they've been the underdog and been able to kind of build on that confidence together as a team. And they just didn't have that at all at the last World Cup. But a lot of that was expectation that's around it. So I'll try and, as much as that's the floor, I'm trying to be optimistic and trying to see where the cracks of kind of the opportunities. So last time around, they had Ecuador, Senegal, who were African champions, and Netherlands in a group. And that was seen as a relatively okay group in a World Cup. It was obviously still difficult. So there's no South American teams this time, which is a real positive. They're really struggling with from that respect. There's no African teams from that perspective. Switzerland, who are difficult. They're obviously a very, very good team, but they're no Netherlands, so that's hopefully an opportunity. Similar from a Bosnia perspective. Now everyone saw it writing on the wall when the qualification came in. They were fearing Italy from that respect, but now that Bosnia's there, it's at least on paper a better opportunity for them. And then finally, it's Canada. So it's as much as most people really wanted to go in the World Cup and avoid all the big seeds, Canada's probably the easiest of the hosts to kind of take on. And that's, again, understanding what they're kind of the issues they might go through the same way as Qatar did with the expectation, etc. But I'm trying to polish something here that's probably not going to be polishable. Qatar are the biggest enemy within it. On many cases, if you're a regular Asian team, you would probably see this group and say, oh, there's an opportunity, maybe to get third place as a progression opportunity. But Qatar are going in with such a lousy form at this stage. I think a miracle needs to happen. So it doesn't really matter who's in front of them. So I'm just hoping that they get a point, let alone a win that might kind of get us a bit excited that they might come third and get us a lucky loser.
All right. So what do you think was the impact or the ramifications of Qatar hosting in 2022? And has that had any broader implications on Asian football?
Yeah. I think it was a difficult time for Asian football, because I think you always there was so much criticism of the World Cup in general heading into 2022, and you guys are probably experiencing that now going into 2026. There's a lot more focus on kind of macro things that aren't to do with football at all, but have interrelations. You're in the spotlight in that respect. So that weighed heavy, I think, on Asian football generally to kind of look at itself and kind of say, well, what do we want to be known for from that respect? And I think it's early days to kind of understand what the legacy is, but you can already see that the same sort of issues that have happened at previous World Cups. You have kind of stadiums laying empty or at least kind of being half used from that respect. And it takes some time to kind of build through that youth academy kind of aspects. You got Qataris and the whole of the Gulf came together as a footballing family, really, to make that event what it was. But you still had that kind of downside about a lot of the politics that were kind of associated with it. I think what Qatar and maybe the QFA are probably quite proud of, they probably say we're the number one hosting venue on the planet. If you want to host a tournament or anything from that respect, come to Qatar and you can do it. We've got ready-made stadiums. we haven't got the same issues as America in terms of you can get around all the stadiums within an hour. You don't have to kind of fly around the place or anything from that respect. But I think from a football perspective, you want more from that side. And I think that will only take time to kind of move on. But you're going back to the same limitations. There's only so much of your population that you can actually get involved in football and kind of drive it through. The facilities are unbelievable from that respect. So it's always going to be externalized. Kind of, well, what's the impact in that respect? And I think it's possibly difficult with Saudi on your doorstep, putting so much investment into it, and they've obviously got a significant kind of even a home base that they can drive a lot of this success from. It will take time for it to kind of materialize into something that we really want to see, that we can say that was Qatar 2022 legacy. My fear is that it'll just become that they can host things more often now because they've got the kind of infrastructure that's in place.
Do they still have the stadium that's like made with crates, or did they actually demolish that one?
They haven't demolished it yet. So it was promised to, I've forgotten what African nation it was promised to, but now it's new home supposed to be Uruguay. But knowing off, my parents were only in Qatar probably a couple of weeks ago, and they said it's still there. But people are still.
It was supposed to be temporary, but like to seat however many people it needed to be official or something. But I was like, still there.
So they've reduced. A lot of the stadiums are still in use, but they're in reduced formats. But again, there's still lots of empty stands, etc. There's only probably a couple of kind of big teams within the QSL that really get proper attendance. It's just because of the amount of people that are available. So yeah, some of the rhetoric in terms of going into it, in terms of these big infrastructure projects, unfortunately are going to kind of take time and kind of gather dust over time, which is a shame.
Larger question, who's your pick to actually win the World Cup?
I put more effort in this time because I think I never even revised ahead of time. I think I said Brazil last time, so whoever I go through this time is going to have the same look. I think
I'm going to make a tally and I'm going to judge everybody. I'm kidding.
No, I think my hope is that Japan do really well this year, and I'm hoping. I don't think they'll win it. I think the tournament's too big. I was talking to someone the other day. It was kind of if it was a smaller tournament, you only needed to win 3 or 4 games to win the tournament. I think Japan could be in that. I think just because you've got to get through 6 or 7 rounds for however big this tournament is, it might be a bit more of a struggle. So I'm going to kind of pick for somebody a bit more established. I think France for consistency always seem to kind of get to those kind of latter stages. They've got the experience in that respect. So France is my pick for this year.
All right. And last question. Is there anything I haven't asked that you think is interesting that people might want to know or should know?
I think the question mark around the Iranian war and how that kind of plays out is going to be an interesting aspect. I say interesting in the most kind of perverted sense. I think the appetite for Gulf nationals to go over to the US or to Mexico or to Canada is going to be kind of interesting to be observed, and what the fallout of that is going to be and how that kind of breaks out of it. You can see that FIFA are having the same difficulties in terms of how this logistically plays out. The AFC are having even more problems. We're supposed to have the Champions League come back next week with Iranian teams in it. That's just never going to happen. But it's just we're playing on this kind of very short-term basis of not knowing where we're going to stand in a couple of weeks. So I'm interested in how that kind of plays out on a kind of a larger scale. Obviously, Iran being the kind of key team within that, but Qatar have an involvement in that as well, no doubt.
We're recording this on April 7th. I don't know.
We've got a few more hours, haven't we? A few more hours until the deadline. So.
It's such a fucked up situation. I don't even know where to begin with it. Anyway, Martin, where can people follow you if you want to be followed?
Follow me if they want to. I'm on Twitter still, or X, or whatever it's called, at Plastic Pitch. And the Asian Game is at the Asian Game. As I say, we'll be covering the full event, whatever happens, but also the interesting bits outside the World Cup, the Asian Cup, Champions League, day-to-day goings on in Asian football. I encourage anybody to get interested in it. It's very exciting.
Cool. I really appreciate these conversations. Thank you for taking the time, Martin.
Yeah, it's really good to speak to you again.
Well, my name's Craig King. I cover Swiss football in English on Twitter and Instagram, and I have done so for the last 10 or so years. Obviously, I'm not Swiss, so yeah, it's a bit of a strange avenue that I found myself in. But yeah, I basically fell into Swiss football, and I've been covering it ever since, and know more about it now than ever thought that I would do. So
Cool. All right. Let's start here. How do you feel this World Cup in particular is being covered by Swiss media or people who are involved in Swiss football?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement about it. This team has been going along in these tournaments for so many years now. This is the 6th straight World Cup, 7th straight major tournament that they've been in, and they've just kind of quietly went along and done that every time, so consistent. And I don't think a lot of people really rate them still. A lot of people kind of dismiss Switzerland a lot, even though they've been one of the most consistent sides, and there's only a handful of major nations that have kind of had that same consistency across the board qualifying. When you look at teams like Italy and other nations of a similar size to Switzerland, maybe Sweden and nations like that, they don't always get there. So it's been incredibly consistent from the team, and the media is again as ever excited about the tournament. It feels like now the team's really building towards something special after the last 2 Euros where they got to the quarterfinals. The last World Cup wasn't too great with the defeat to Portugal, but they've always kind of impressed in tournaments. And it seems like now, even though after the last tournament, after the last Euros, there was a lot of players retired, Jan Sommer, Fabian Schär, Xherdan Shaqiri most notably, who had been relied upon so often for the team for so many years. And there was a lot of worry that once he went, that Switzerland would start to kind of transition and they might struggle to make these tournaments. But if anything, they seem to have got better, and they seem better placed going into this tournament than maybe any of the other ones that they've been in recently to actually go and make a mark. They've never been past the last 16 of the World Cup for a long time. I think it might have been 1954 World Cup that they hosted that they last managed to get past the round of 16. But there's a real belief that they can kind of replicate what they did at the Euros and at least get to the quarter-final. So yeah, a lot of excitement and a lot of belief in the team that they can keep kind of surprising people, because from the outside I still think they don't get a lot of credit.
So if I could ask you maybe to separate the journalist from like just the everyday public, like the people you would have been interacting with that are fans of Servette and others, how are they feeling about this one? Is there like more maybe scrutiny about the competition, or is that same kind of fervor still there because it's a World Cup?
Yeah, I think the World Cup always brings excitement regardless. It doesn't matter how many times you're there. You might kind of get numb to the fact that you qualify all the time, but I think once you're there, it's amazing to be part of that spectacle. But I think, when you look back at 2014, even 2010, when they kind of first were qualifying for these tournaments again, there wasn't really an expectation on them so much. There was kind of hope that they would get out the group. They got the odd big result. They beat Spain, of course, at the 2010 World Cup. And they got some big results along the way, but it wasn't until 2014 onwards that they started really impressing in the groups and getting out the groups consistently. But in 2014 there wasn't really expectation on them either. It was a kind of hope to get out the group and then see what happens in the knockout stage. But now we get to this point, the last few tournaments, including the Euros, including the last World Cup, where there's a real expectation on them to get out the group and then possibly go beyond that. Even when they get drawn against teams like France and Portugal, there's still a kind of belief in the team that they can go and get a big result. Even the Portugal game at the last World Cup, it was 6-1 or 6-0, I think it finished. Portugal definitely scored 6. I might have just added a goal on for Switzerland just to make me feel better. But that game, Portugal on their day are a very, very good team and can do that to other nations. But there was still a lot of disappointment in the Swiss team because they kind of let themselves down. So I think when there is a bad result now, the kind of spotlight's a lot bigger. Whereas if this is 10 years ago, there's disappointment. Of course, there was times when Switzerland exited tournaments to Sweden and Poland in the knockouts at the Euros and at the World Cup where they maybe should have done better, but they kind of got away with it to an extent because it was still, it wasn't as expected of them to go on and do these great things. But now, especially this World Cup, when they've got a pretty straightforward group on paper, they're expected not only to get out the group, but then also kind of replicate what they've done before. I think when you give the fans a taste of what you've managed to do with the big results against France, even the last Euros against Italy, when they won that knockout game comfortably, when they took England to penalties as well and were so close to the semi-final, I think, once you kind of show that's what you're capable of, I think the expectation level just keeps rising. And again, it will be that way. As long as they don't let themselves down, I think most fans are kind of content. But if they do kind of perform in a way that's not at their level, then yeah, there's a lot more scrutiny on them these days.
So I'm going to make you a doctor of sorts, and I'm going to ask, describe for me the condition of Swiss football, both domestically and maybe foreign exports. Is it in a healthy place, or is it more off color?
I think it's in a healthy place in terms of the standard of players that are now leaving the league to go elsewhere. You've got a lot of players in Germany. You've got players like Granit Xhaka and all those sorts of guys that have went away to other parts of Europe. There's a real kind of pathway out of the league now, not only to Germany but to the Premier League and other places. There's so many players playing in Italy, England, Spain, Germany mostly, some in France as well. So there's really a good selection of players that are making that leap. And I can't remember the exact number, but there was a kind of a stat a few months ago that kind of showed the level now compared to, maybe 10, 20 years ago, that just wasn't happening as much. So in that respect, it's a lot better, and it's a lot better for the national team to have so many players going away and playing in better leagues, to be quite honest. At home, domestically, it's probably quite weak at the moment. Young boys, of course, even before that, Basel dominated for so long, and then someone else finally won the league, young boys, and you kind of thought that might be a good thing for the league because someone else has ended Basel's dominance. But then young boys just went on and done the same thing for a good number of years, which wasn't ideal. Zurich interrupted that just after COVID pandemic. They won a title as well, and there was some challenges there as well, but then young boys won it again, and it's kind of just been the status quo sort of thing. Basel won it last year, but to me they were kind of the best of a bad bunch. It was so inconsistent across the board, and Basel were really helped by Shaqiri's return. He had an outstanding kind of anomaly season. He's struggling this season in terms of he's not hitting anywhere near those numbers that he did last season, but he was a big part of the reason why Basel won the league. And again, this season it's just so strange because now we've got a team that's promoted last season from the second division that are going to win the league. They're 12 points clear. There's 6 games left, I believe, and they're not going to get caught. And for a team, in one instance, it's a great story, fairy tale stuff. This team has came from the second division. They've never won a major honour like this before, and they're going to win the league title. But also, what does that say for the league, that they've managed to come up and they've not strengthened? They've not really strengthened at all. They've just had a lot of consistency in terms of the squad and the management team, and they're going to win the league. So it's not a good look for the rest of the league again, even if it probably gets more eyes on the league in terms of people will be interested in the story. But yeah, domestically, I think, and we've seen it in Europe this season as well with a lot of the teams, it's a real struggle now for Swiss teams to really compete in Europe. And again, it's shown in the quality of the league too, so that's not a good thing. But again, there's not really that many players in the league that play for the national team now. It's across the board, a lot of players in Europe. So yeah, there's pros and cons to that question. There's good stuff about the national team and the players, but yeah, the league quality is not great. But then again, I know I'm biased, but from my point of view, it's kind of it's just a fun league that way. There's lots of goals and there's still lots of drama. So if you're not really looking for amazing football and you're not really a football snob sort of thing, then you can enjoy that league still as well. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's in the same kind of place it was in terms of being able to put itself on the European stage as it used to be.
So let's get into qualification. So how did Switzerland qualify? Was it easy? And maybe what's been their form in the international friendlies since?
Yeah, so I would think there was a real change last summer. I want to mention the Euros qualifying first because that was an easy group on paper. They had Israel in there, Kosovo, Andorra, Belarus and Romania. And they ended up qualifying in second place with more draws than wins in that group. They started that group well, and then they basically kept throwing away leads in the last 10 minutes. Most infuriating thing to watch ever because you could see it coming. Then it did happen every single time. I think five times they conceded after like 80 minutes. And it was a real worry because mentality-wise it was becoming a real issue. But they did qualify mainly because these other teams weren't good enough to punish their slip-ups. But then they went to the Euros and got to the quarterfinals, took England all the way, like I mentioned. And then since then they've just kind of kept rolling on. The Nations League was quite poor, but of course they've never performed in the Nations League really for years. I don't know why. I don't know if they just don't take it seriously, but they came through that, and then they went to America for friendlies against USA and Mexico last summer, and they won both games comfortably. Really impressive performances. And then they went into the qualifying for the World Cup, probably in my opinion their hardest group so far. They had Sweden in there, Kosovo in there as well, Slovenia, and you thought this could be quite difficult because it was such a small group. You think, there's not much room for error here, and Sweden are probably the toughest side you've faced in a while. But then they went through that group unbeaten. They only conceded a couple of goals, and they were really quite comfortable. They qualified so easily, and that was really surprising to me. So over the last year I've seen kind of a distinct change, which again is surprising because I expected a kind of downturn from the Euros after the retirement of guys like Shaqiri. You wondered how the team would respond to missing all those kind of key players that have been the core part of this team for so long. And but they've just seemed to have, kept rolling on and getting better. So qualifying was really easy. I think it was helped by Sweden not playing to their best. I think they're at a better place now than they were. Oddly enough, despite finishing bottom, they qualified as well. But yeah, which is its own story. But yeah, I think the qualifying was much easier than I could have anticipated. And again, it adds to that expectation. If you can do all these great things since last summer, they're just building that momentum. And again, going into this kind of easy group on paper, there's a real belief that they can make the mark on this tournament.
Definitely. So are fans happy with Murat Yakin, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly?
Yeah.
And if you could describe for us maybe his style of play.
Yeah, so it's a strange one, He was brought in after the last Euros. It was a strange timeline, obviously, because of the pandemic, and so Vladimir Petkovic took the team for the first part of the qualifying for the World Cup, I believe, and then Euros happened, and they got to the quarter-final after beating France, and then Petkovic left, and Murat Yakin came in, but he was a manager that had won titles with Basel and had top-flight experience as a manager. He'd managed elsewhere in Europe. But at that time when he was appointed, he was managing in the second division of Switzerland. He'd kind of, his credit was gone, and he was in the second division, kind of a promotion challenging team, but they weren't going to get promoted. So the decision to go for him was a really odd one. It was met with kind of, there's a lot of criticism, like it's not a big name, it's not, surely Switzerland can attract someone of a higher calibre than him. But he came in and he made his team really difficult to beat. He drew twice with Italy. Jan Sommer saved 2 Jorginho penalties, I believe, or they missed 2 penalties against Switzerland, and Switzerland managed to get through that group and qualify. But then you came to the World Cup and they did really well at the World Cup again, but it's almost like you're walking on eggshells with him at times, because he makes just random decisions in games where you just wonder, like, what's his thought process here. But they got out that group stage, and obviously they get beat by Portugal, and people were asking for his head after that because it was such a heavy defeat and it was just really a lifeless performance. But then again, he kind of restored some credit, they played better again, and then they went into that Euros qualifying and struggled so much that to the point that they had to come out before the tournament and say he's going to stay on, he's going to be the manager. But then at the Euros they performed fantastically again, even though once more he made strange decisions. He brought in a striker that had played one game. He was playing in Bulgaria. He played one game in a friendly just before the tournament, 45 minutes, and then he started him in the first game against Hungary, and he scored in that game. So there was a lot of things where he would make decisions like that and you question it, like, why is this player playing in this position, why are you starting him? But then ultimately it would pay off. So it's a bit of a head scratcher, but so far I feel like he's kind of just still 50-50. It's one of those ones where as soon as it goes wrong, he starts getting that pressure on his back. And again, some of it is self-inflicted because you feel like he makes these decisions that don't need to be made. But again, he's taken these risks and he's managed to get some big performances out of it. So yeah, he's one of those managers that splits opinion, and again, no doubt, if Switzerland underperform at this tournament, he's going to be under pressure again. It probably might be his last tournament anyway, but yeah, he's going to be under pressure again. But he is a manager that I think made his teams hard to beat at first, but now the team is more settled to him. The players are more settled. I would say there's more goals across the whole team, especially in the striking department. You've got a lot more players that you can rely on rather than just Shaqiri, which was the problem for such a long time, even though he always delivered. So now he's got a lot more fluidity in terms of the way they play, and there's just whole structure. Everything's settled about the team now, and I think that helps him a lot, even if he does then go and make some odd decisions now and again that make you scratch your head. But for the most part, he's in good favour for now.
All right, so I'm going to just throw some proper nouns at you. So Granit Xhaka is a name most people would know. Manuel Akanji is a name a lot of people would know. But Switzerland, for me, aren't really, they don't have like a superstar in their team. Of course, they have, as you say, players that play in the Premier League, the Bundesliga, but they don't have like a guy. And in some ways, perhaps that's a good thing. So who from, the kind of cohort that we know, do you think are in a good moment to have a good World Cup? And then maybe a couple of players that maybe we don't know that much about that are also in a good moment to perform.
Yeah, so of course you mentioned Granit Xhaka. He's someone that it used to be the case that when Shaqiri and Xhaka played together, it was always, what's going to happen when Shaqiri retires, because he's dug Switzerland out of so many situations. But then he kind of was phased out, especially in the last Euros. He only started one game. He still scored a magnificent goal against Scotland, sadly. But yeah, he scored that goal, and he still delivered. But then he retired, and it's almost like Switzerland haven't missed him. Of course, you would still love to have those moments of magic and that sort of player in your team, but it's not like we're watching games now and thinking, we could really do with Shaqiri here. And a big part of that is the way that Granit Xhaka's kind of not came out of the shadow, because he was performing so well for so long anyway, but he's become a real captain, a real leader for the team. He's the most capped men's national player now for Switzerland, and he's just such a fantastic role model for the players coming up. It's such a kind of cliche, but now it is going to be a real problem when Xhaka goes, because he is the heartbeat of that team, and his leadership skills are just second to none. I think the best story that I like about him is against England in the last Euros. He was injured in that game. He still played. He couldn't play long balls. He couldn't hit shots, but he still played the game, and he was fantastic in that match. So he's a player that Switzerland really can't do without, but he's probably the name, like you say, that most people know. There aren't many kind of household names, but I do think it's helped Switzerland to an extent, because you've got kind of a core group of players that are just very, very good, rather than one standout player. Like, I always look at Wales, who've done fantastically well for so long, but again, there was such a reliance on Gareth Bale, whereas the rest of the team were kind of levels below him. But I feel like this Switzerland team as a whole has got many good players in it. Guys like Jan Sommer, who then got replaced by Gregor Kobel, and before this run that he's got after Sommer retired, he only had 8 caps. And that's any other national team, he's going to have a lot more caps than that. But Switzerland just have such a plethora of good goalkeepers. Akanji as well, a strong, solid defender, probably gets into most national teams, but he's again not a superstar. But that to me is the core of the Switzerland team, and has been for such a long time. I think other players that I can mention, Dan Ndoye plays in the Premier League. He's really started to deliver for the team recently, even though he's not lighting up in the Premier League when he plays for Switzerland. He plays at his best. Ruben Vargas as well, who plays for Augsburg in Germany. Again, not a player that's going to come to mind, but a player that usually delivers for Switzerland. Another one that I want to mention is Johan Manzambi, who again was not on my radar at all. I'm not even sure I'd heard of him before last summer, which I probably shouldn't say, but he was called up for the first time for those friendlies against the US and Mexico, and he did really well in those games. He's got a few goals and assists to his name already. He mostly comes off the bench, and I think that will be the case at the World Cup as well. But to me, he's a standout player that will come on and kind of make people take notice of him. He scored a wonderful goal against Bayern last weekend, for Freiburg, and he's a player that's really exciting as well. So you've got a lot of these players that have been there and settled for so long. Some players like Manzambi, Fabian Rieder, who plays in the Bundesliga as well. He made his World Cup debut against Brazil as a 19-year-old as well. So, these players have got some experience, even though they're young. And also Dylan Bowe as well, who has had a lot of injury problems but seems to be fit now for the long term, which is great news because he's been delivering consistently in the goals front. Zeki Amdouni's had a long-term injury. He plays for Burnley. He's scoring the goals as well, the kind of striker that Switzerland have missed for so long. I don't know if he'll be back to his best, after that long-term injury, but there's a lot more players to rely on, especially in the attacking department, where the goals were kind of coming always from guys like Shaqiri, and there wasn't that many goals across the team when you look back at strikers that Switzerland have had in the past, like Seferovic and Gavranovic. They delivered in moments, but never consistently. But now I feel like there's attacking players there that can deliver consistently, and then of course you've got that strong midfield led by Xhaka, and then the defence has been settled. I think it's been the same back four for many years now. Ricardo Rodriguez has been there since like 2011, so yeah, there's a lot of experience. There's a mix of experience and youth in the team, so to me it's an exciting kind of group that's coming through, even despite what we've lost in the past kind of 12 months with Sommer and Fabian Schär and Shaqiri.
So with the kind of optimism that's there, I wonder, does that bring a bit of pressure? So the question is, what is an acceptable floor and what is the ceiling for this particular iteration? Because as you say, in the research for this, they haven't been in the quarterfinals since 1954. And before that, it was like in the 1930s. So what's the floor and what's the ceiling?
Yeah, so I think, that there is some worry because, like I mentioned, that qualifying group with all those kind of smaller teams in it should have been so easy, and they made such a mess of it and were lucky and they end up to qualify. They've got this group here with 3 teams that are tricky, but they should not have any problem coming out of the group. I think they only need like 1 win and not to have a negative goal difference, and they can get through. And even if they have to play Canada, in Canada they've still got 2 games against Qatar and Bosnia that they should win. But in the back of my head there's kind of that thing where I'm like, well, what if they do what they did during that qualifying and take it for granted? But I'd like to think that Switzerland at major tournaments are a bit more street smart than that. But yeah, I think they absolutely have to get out of the group. There's more pressure and expectation, I think, on getting out of the group now than there has been in the last 7 major tournaments, just because of the quality in the group. You would look at that and say Switzerland are the best team in there, which probably hasn't been the case for any of the other groups that they've been in. So they absolutely have to get out of the group, otherwise it'll be a disaster. So that is the bare minimum, especially topping the group. They should top the group. After that, I always said that it kind of matters who you get next, but given what they did against Italy and France at the Euros, it's kind of set the benchmark there where they can compete with anyone. To me, they're just kind of under those elite nations, but on their day they can compete with anyone. So the ceiling really, I think it probably would be semi-finals. I think the expectation would be to get to the quarterfinals this time, the World Cup finally, after doing it at the Euros twice. And if they top the group, they should get an easier game. So yeah, I think the absolute ceiling would be semi-finals, and that for Switzerland would be magnificent. But they really should have no problem getting out of the group. If they don't get out of that group, then you might not see me again.
All right, 2 more questions. Who's your pick to win the World Cup?
I'm going to go with Spain. It might be an obvious answer, but I just feel like they are the nation that stands out most. I don't look at any of the other nations and think, that they're incredibly consistent, or of course they've all got their qualities, but Spain for so long have just been, scoring so many goals and tearing teams apart, and I can't really see any nation stopping them. Even Argentina have been, obviously they won the last World Cup and they've been good, but I just think Spain would have too much attacking quality for everyone else.
And lastly, is there anything I haven't asked you about Switzerland specifically that you think is interesting that people might want to know or should know?
Well, I would say that most people seem to underestimate the fans when it comes to Switzerland. And having been lucky enough to kind of experience the atmosphere that they bring, myself in person, it's they are kind of underrated. I think people see Switzerland as a kind of calm like nation that's not going to be, you know, totally passionate about their football and all that sort of stuff.
Rich and like snobby.
Yeah. So yeah, that could be one way of putting it. But yeah, there's so much passion for the national team that fans travel far and wide. Even last summer in those friendlies in America, travelling and supporting the team well indeed. So yeah, I think people will be surprised again by the support that is brought for the team. Again, like I say, there's people that probably wouldn't think that Switzerland have a great fan scene, even domestically. Sometimes I'll post videos of, you know, just like things like pyrotechnic displays and all that, and people are surprised that this is happening in Switzerland. But it's a really passionate for its football, for being such a small country. Yeah, so I think the fans are going to add their own kind of element to the tournament as well.
Cool. Craig, thank you for doing this. Where can people follow you?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter. I know it's not called that anymore, but I refuse to call it by the other name. So you can follow me on Twitter at FootballSwissEN. Instagram is the same as well. I don't update that as much. But yeah, mostly Twitter. You can follow me on there and ask me any questions you want about Swiss football.
Cool. Thanks again for doing this, man. I always really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.